Okay, we're up to Daf Samach Zayin Amid Aleph. I'll tell you how many lines down. We are Debei Rabbi Shmuel Tana, so it's about 10 lines into the page. So just to review, the Gemara had said like this. The Pasuk says it's two lengthy psukim. It's Pasuk in Perik Yud Aleph, Pasuk Tes, and Pasuk Yud. The Pasuk says, Azeh teichlu mikol asher b'mayim. This is what you could eat, anything that's in the water, all aquatic creatures in the water. Kol asher iloi snafiv v'kaskesas. As long as it has fins and scales. Bayamim bancholim. B'mayim b'yam b'cholim. So as long as it has fins and scales, you could eat it. If it's in the ocean, if it's in the sea, it's in the river. And then the Pasuk says, anything that doesn't have, then you're not allowed. It doesn't have fins and scales, you can't eat. So the Gemara had said that you see from this Pasuk a Yesod, and that is that aquatic creatures in the ocean, seas, and rivers, you could only eat if they have fins and scales. But if, let's say, you have a worm which is generated in the water itself, so you're not allowed to eat it, right? If you have a bug that's in the ocean, you're not allowed to eat it. Why are you not allowed to eat it? Why are you not allowed to eat it if there's a bug that's in the ocean? The reason being is because they don't have fins and scales. But the Gemara was medayik that I'm giving that. So the Gemara says like this: the issue is that if it was generated in those areas, it needs to have fins and scales, and because it doesn't, it's a problem. However, if you were to have a bug that is generated not in the oceans, the seas, or the river, let's say you have a bug that's generated in a bucket of water. So the Gemara says you're allowed to eat it as long as it has generated in that area and has never left that area. It's not a bug that's a problem. It's not a kol hasheretz hasheretz ala aretz. It's never been on the aretz, and it doesn't require fins and scales because the pasuk identifies the requirement of fins and scales of beyamim benacholim, which is oceans, rivers, and seas. And we said yesterday that excludes buckets of water. That also excludes boirei shichin amares, which are pits, which are gathered water, which are not alive water, not flowing water. The only time bugs are a problem is if they're on the ground, if they've stepped on the ground, that's sheretz al aretz, or if it's a bug in a water that was generated in water, it's only a problem if it's in the oceans, the seas, or the rivers. And the Gemara had excluded pits, and the Gemara excluded buckets of water, but it included seas, oceans, rivers, and any canals and ponds that are basically fresh, live water, moving water. So yesterday, the way we got to this was from a klal uprat klal. The Gemara will make the same exact drasha, but instead of klal uprat klal, it's going to use ribo yomiyat. Throughout Shas, you always have an option. You have klal uprat klal, ribo yomiyat. It's unclear exactly why some Tanaim are more moved to ribo yomiyat as opposed to klal uprat klal. I'll explain in a moment. The main difference between klal uprat klal and ribo yomiyat is that by klal uprat klal, the prat it defines the klal, meaning that it includes anything that's very similar to the specification, as opposed to ribo miyut. Ribo miyut is just, it includes a lot and it excludes one thing. It doesn't have to be that the specification is super similar. Okay, says the Gemara. Debei Rabbi Shmuel Tana, the Rabbi Shmuel says, B'mayim shtei pamim, ein ze klal uprata, elo ribo miyut. It's not a klal uprata klal, it's a ribo miyut. And the mamish the same drasha, but using a different methodology. B'mayim is beriba. B'yam mechala miyut. B'mayim chaza v'riba. Ribu miyut v'riba. Riba hakol. It's marbe that there's a problem of bugs in all things. My Rabbi, what does it include? Charitzin, nitzin, lisura. It includes canals and ponds. Umay miyut, and what's excluded, what's permissible, what type of bugs are permissible? Boirei shichin maris latera. Pits, ditches, and caves, and obviously buckets of water. So says the Gemara, it's mamish the same thing. It's just a ribu miyat instead of a klal protocol. Eba my riba boirei shichin maris lisura my miyat kalim. The Gemara says, how do you know that it's marbe that you're allowed to drink bugs that come from pits, ditches, and caves? Maybe the only types of bugs that are permitted are in vessels. Then what do you do with the word teichlu? The word teichlu is to include things, and therefore the ribu yomiyat is to include, the teichlu is to include buckets, and ribu yomiyat is to include the bugs that are from a boirei shichin amaris. The Gemara says, wait a minute. You see, when it was a klal prat klal, the prat has to be very, very similar, which is, what's the Torah specifying? The Torah specifies oceans, rivers, seas. So therefore it makes sense that what's included in that is something very similar, which are ponds and canals, which are fresh, bubbling water. But now that you're telling me it's a ribu miyat doesn't have to be super similar. It's just marbas a lot and memayit something. So the Gemara says instead of saying what's mutter is a vessel and what's aser is bugs that are found in the ponds and canals, maybe the opposite. Maybe ponds and canals are permitted and buckets of water are a problem. So the Gemara says no, kidetani matasyo, because as matasyo taught, tani matasyo by Yehuda. My rois l'rabbeis bar shichan amar salatera. Why do I include pits, ditches, and caves that bugs in those areas are permissible? Haitzi charitza nitzin, and I exclude canals and ponds that are prohibited to eat bugs there. Maybe the opposite. So the Gemara says mar bani bar shichan amaris. The reason why I do this is shein atzurin kikelim. The answer is even with the ribu amiyat, it has to have some level of similarity. The pasuk specified bugs being a problem in oceans, seas, and rivers. The common theme of those things is not just that they're fresh, it's that the water is flowing, the water is not contained. And therefore, pits and ditches and canals where the water is contained have no similarity to oceans, and therefore it makes more sense. Oceans are going to be aser, ponds are going to be aser, but pits, ditches, and caves, they're mamish, the water is gathered together, it has no shaykhis to the ocean, and therefore that's going to be permissible. One last little Gemara, which is a little bit tricky, and the rest of the Gemara is much, much easier. We said yesterday, this is just a little bit because you have to be holding in the cheshbon of yesterday's daf. We said yesterday that the Gemara had said, I'll read you the lines from yesterday's daf. The Gemara says like this. Hoyel v'hitter b'mefurish. The pasuk again there's two psukim. There's fins and scales eat, without fins and scales don't eat. Now when it comes to bugs, the Gemara says, hitter b'mefurish. It was matir in the mefurish pasuk. In one of the psukim which is clear, the pasuk was matir, and hitter b'sasum, and was matir in the closed off pasuk. Whatever these psukim, whatever it means, we'll explain right now. Makashe b'mefurish, just like in the pasuk that was clear, lehitter el b'kelim, it was only matir bugs in vessels. So too the pasuk that's closed off is also only bugs in vessels. In other words, these two psukim, the one pasuk says if it has fins and scales eat, the other pasuk says if it doesn't have fins and scales don't eat. Those two psukim are also the sources to tell you that bugs in a pit, in a bucket can be drunk because they don't need fins and scales. But when the Gemara described it, the Gemara described one of the pasuk as mefurish and one of the pasuk as sasum. And the Gemara just wants to know which one is which. I'm not sure if it matters much in halacha, but the Gemara says, Hai sasam, hai mefurish. Pligi b'Rabacha v'Rivina. Chad Amar, yesh loy mefurish. Ve'ein loy sasam. One opinion says, the pasuk says that if you have fins and scales, you may eat. That's the mefurish pasuk. Ve'ein loy sasam. And the next pasuk, which says, if you do not have fins and scales, don't eat. That's the sasam pasuk. V'chad Amar, the opposite. Ein loy mefurish, v'yesh loy sasam. So the Gemara just speaks out why does each opinion say which it does. Again, basically the Gemara wants to know what is the source that you're allowed to drink bugs in a bucket. Is it from the pasuk of yesh loy sanafir v'kaskasas, or is it from the pasuk of ein loy sanafir v'kaskasas? So the Gemara says, "My time at the mother of yesh loy mefurish." The one who says that the source is from yesh loy, amar lach minehu dekameshtari kalim. He says, "Well, I'll tell you why. Because if you remember in yesterday's daf, the source that you're allowed to drink bugs from the bucket of water is from that pasuk, because it says yesh loy sanafir v'kaskasas." That the pasuk that says you have to have fins and scales, that was only referring to the oceans, but by buckets it wasn't referring to. So that's the source, that's the mefurish. My time at the mother ein loy mefurish, and the other opinion says no. Haihu de kamoyich achech, the imehech havamina bekelim, avagav de islay nami loy techal. The Gemara just says, again, this is the last part that's a little tricky. If you remember in yesterday's daf, the Gemara said, I understand that the first pasuk makes a distinction. The first pasuk of yesh loy safri v'kaskeses makes a distinction between oceans and buckets. So we said the distinction is that buckets you could drink bugs in. The Gemara had said yesterday, maybe it's the opposite. Maybe that there is a distinction, but when there's in the buckets, even fish with fins and scales you can't eat. I understand there's a difference, but how do you know that it's to be matir? Maybe it's to be machmer. And the Gemara had said yesterday it's from the second pasuk of ein loy snafi v'kaskasas. That tells you that you're always allowed to eat fish with fins and scales. So it must be the pasuk that makes a distinction is saying that if there's a bucket of water, you could drink bugs. The point is, according to this opinion, the real heter, one of the ways that you're mimater drinking bugs in a bucket of water is from the second pasuk, and therefore he calls the second pasuk the mafurish pasuk. Okay. Now the rest of the daf is a lot more simple. We said yesterday that if bugs are generated in a bucket of water, they're permitted. Now, the second they were to leave this bucket of water, right, if they were to go on the ground and start crawling, that would be a problem because that's called sheretz hasheretz ala aretz. The whole heter is that they were created in that bucket of water and they've never left that environment. So the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says, Amar Rav Huna, lo lishvi inish shichra b'tziviyasa bu'urta. A person should not sift beer through wood chips. The way they would sift beer to make sure that there was no impurities, they would take the beer. They didn't have strainers. They would take wood chips. They would pour the liquid over the wood chips, and the wood chips would catch all the big impurities. The Gemara says, don't do that at night. Why? Dilma parish. Let me say it outside. We'll see it inside. Basically, if you drink beer, right? Let's say you have a bucket of beer, and there's a bug in there. Technically, if that bug never left the beer, it was in that bucket, right? You have a bucket of water. You pour the hops in. You pour the whatever. You make beer. Now, if the bug was created in that bucket, we said it's fine. How do you know that bug is always in the bucket? Well, the answer is, if the bucket was always closed off and there's no reason to think the bug came from outside, then it's going to be okay. Says the Gemara, do not sift beer at night. Why? Because what might happen is you might pour the beer over the wood chips. The bug might leave the water, go on the wood chips for a few seconds, walk around the wood chips, technically having left its location of the water where it was originally created, then go back in the water. Now, because this is all happening at night, you're not seeing this. If it was during the day, you could be watching it to see if there's any movement of the bugs, whatever it is. I don't know, it's hard to see, but at least conceptually it's possible. But at night, it's impossible to see. So don't sift it at night because the bug might leave in the water, might go on the wood chip, crawl around for a few seconds, which will then make it a classic bug that's prohibited. And then if it goes back in the water, it's going to be a problem. But you're not going to know this. You're just going to see a bug in the water and say, oh, Avi and Daf Yomi said that a bug in a bucket of water is permissible, not realizing that that bug crawled on a wood chip for a moment. So that's what the Gemara says. Now, the issue is that the bug will have left the water for a second and walked on a wood chip. And that's a problem because that means that the bug... What, look at the keys? I don't know. I didn't try. They might know upstairs. The point is, the bug will have left the water for a moment and walk on the wood chip. Now, the Gemara says, and that's a problem because it left its original habitat. So let me ask you a question, the Gemara says. How do you know that any time you have a bucket of water there's a bug in, we said you could drink? Why? Because it never left its habitat. But maybe it walked on the side of the bucket. Again, if you're telling me walking on a wood chip is a problem because now it's left its environment and now it's just a classic bug, sheretz al aretz. So if you have a bucket, if the bug were to walk on the side of the bucket, inside the bucket, which is very possible, it just goes to the side for a moment, that should also make it a problem. Says the Gemara, maybe it went to the side of the bucket, the wall of the vessel, walked around the wall for a second, and then fell back in. So how are you ever able to drink bugs in a bucket of water? So the Gemara says, Hasam Hainu Rabbi say, that would not cause that a problem. It's only a problem if the bug leaves its natural habitat. Walking on a wood chip is not normal when it's created in water. But if it was created in a bucket of water, walking on the side of the bucket is permissible. It will not create a problem because that's its habitat. You see, if it were to leave the bucket and then come back, that would be a problem. Walking on the side, inside the walls of the vessel, is actually considered its natural habitat, and it would not be creating a problem. Umina Timra, how do I know that walking on the side of the vessel, inside, is not an issue? Tanya, because the Brisa says, we said yesterday that if you have water that's in a pit, a ditch, or a cave, it's permissible because that's where it was created. But wait, let me ask you a question, the same point. How do you know it didn't walk inside to the walls of the pit, or the walls of the ditch, or the walls of the cave, and then fall back in? What's the answer? The answer is it must be that even if it were to do this, it would be permissible because that's its environment. Inside the walls of where it was created is considered part of the water itself, and that does not pose a problem. The Gemara says, the Gemara says, wait, how are you permitted to drink water that's in a pit, ditch, or cave? Dilma parish ledafna v'hadar nafal. Maybe it went to the side of the pit, walked around, and then fell back in. And that should be a problem. It must be, the conclusion you have to make is that the sides of the pit is permissible. Even if we're walking the sides of the pit, so to the sides of the bucket is also permissible. Amalei Rav Chizda Rav Huna. Rav Chizda said to Rav Huna, I have a proof, again, to back up your point, that the side is okay. Tani dem sayelach, I have a brisa that backs it up. Why? Because the brisa says, the pasuk says, Kol hashayretz hasharetz al aretz, that any bug that creeps on the ground is forbidden. L'rabos yabchushin shesinanon. This includes gnats that were filtered out of wine. The second they were, like you filter them out and they're on the filter and they start walking around the filter, that's a problem. Even though they were okay when they were in the bucket of wine, because that's where they were created, but the second they start walking around the filter, that's a problem. Taima de sinan, the Gemara implies that the only issue is that they were filtered out. Haloi sinanon, but if they were never filtered out, they would be allowed. What about the fact that they might have been walking around the inside of the vat? The answer is that must not pose a problem. That must be permissible as well. Okay, Amar Shmuel. Now, we said before that it's only a problem if a bug creeps on the ground and it leaves its environment. Now, we said if it was in a bucket of water, that's okay. Another halacha is that if a bug were to be, let's say, created in a detached fruit, so you have an apple that's detached and it's on the floor, and the bug was created in that apple, but it never crawled outside of the apple. It didn't even crawl on the outside. It was inside the apple the whole time. That's permissible, because it was never sharetz ala aretz. So it says the Gemara, Amar Shmuel, Kisha shehetzliya, a cucumber that became wormy, go to the next page, Bavia, that's still attached to the ground, asura mishum hasharetz ala aretz. Meaning, the chiddush is that when a vegetable is attached to the ground, it has the status of the ground itself, and all bugs that are created in those cucumbers that are attached to the ground is ki'ilu they were created on the ground itself, and it's a problem. So if it was detached, it would be okay until it actually steps out of the vegetable and starts crawling around. However, if it was from an attached cucumber, it's mamish ki'ilu, it's mechuber lekarka, and therefore all bugs from there is considered sharetz ala aretz. So there's a difference between detached fruit and attached fruit. Detached fruit is going to be permissible. Attached fruit is going to be a problem. I have a proof to you. What's the proof? The Tani Chada. One brisa says al ha'aretz. Again, his chiddush is that if it's attached to the ground, it's considered mechuber lekarka, and all bugs in those attached fruit that are wormy are a problem because it's sharetz ala aretz. He says, I'll prove it to you why. The Tani Chada, one brisa said al ha'aretz, that the Torah forbids worms that are on the ground. This excludes gnats that are found in chickpeas, that is permissible. Or all worms that are found inside dates and figs, those are permissible. Yeah?
So hydroponic strawberry.
So that's a very good question. Someone asked me about that this morning. I have to look into that. Hydroponic ones, if they were never creeped from outside, I have to look into this. It must be that with the bugs nowadays, they must know that these bugs come from outside of the fruit itself. But I don't know. This whole daf is kind of throwing in a wrench into the whole issue with bugs, because you're right. If I have to look into it further. Bli neder for next year, I'll have a little bit more information. So the Gemara says like this. So one brisa says that if there's a bugs in chickpeas or lentils, permissible. V'tani idach. But there's another brisa. The brisa says that if there are worms that are found in the stems of olives and grapes, it's a problem. So one brisa says a worms in dates and figs is permissible. Another brisa says a worms in the stems of olives and grapes are a problem. So how do you reconcile these two brises? My lav, we assume both of them are talking about in the fruit itself. The worm is not found in the tree or in the branch. It's in the fruit. One brisa says mutter, one brisa says asur. So how do you reconcile this? The answer is, it depends. Is the fruit attached or detached? If it's attached, then it's a problem. If it's because it's mechuber lekarka. If it's detached, then it's permissible. So it's a raya to Shmuel. My love, are we not referring to both brises talking about a case where the bug is in the fruit itself? And the brisa that prohibits it is referring to when it's attached to the ground because then it's mechober lekarka. And the brisa that permits it is talking about where it's not attached to the ground. So the Gemara says, loy. No. Actually, both brises are talking about where they're attached to the ground. So it's not a right to shmu at all. So how do you reconcile this? Loy kasha. Ha bepeira. Haba ilana gufa. One brisa that says that it's aser is talking about where it's attached is one. The brisa that says that it's aser is talking about where it's in the tree itself. Meaning, maybe Shmuel's wrong. Maybe an attached fruit is taka not considered part of the ground, and the bugs are mutter. So when the brisa says it's aser, it's not talking about where the bug is in the fruit. The bug is in the branch. The branch is considered mechubar lekarka for sure. And therefore, you see, you could argue that the fruit is not considered mechubar lekarka because it's meant to be separated. Maybe not like Shmuel. The brisa that says that it's aser is talking about where the bug is not found in the fruit, it's found in the actual branch itself. Dekanami, I'll prove it to you that it's not referring to in the fruit, because the lashon is different. The first brisa says shebet tmarim, the second brisa says shebet ikre zesim. If they were both talking about the fruit like Shmuel thought, then why would they have different lashonos? It must be they're not talking about the fruit. Tak, if it's found in the fruit, that's going to be permissible if it's attached to the ground, because it's not considered mechubar lekarka, it's considered as if it's detached already. The brisa that says it's a problem is not talking about it's in the fruit, it's talking about in the branch. Shema mina. Boy Rav Yosef, now Rav Yosef has a kasha. Now, if you have a bug that's in a detached fruit, so Shmuel said it's permissible, but even those type of bugs, they become aser once they come out of the fruit and crawl on the ground. So the question is, at what point, when they leave the fruit, do they become aser? By Rabbi Yosef, Pirsha umeisa ma'u. What if they leave the fruit and they fall to the ground, but they don't crawl? They die. They drop dead. They hit the ground. There was poison on the ground. They died. So they never crawled on the ground, but they were on the ground. So is it the al haaretz or it's a shayritz al haaretz? They crawled on the ground. They didn't crawl, but they're on the ground. Or miktsasama. What if part of it was still on the ground, and part of it was like a centipede, where it's part of it, I don't know, a centipede, whatever, a long bug, where part of it is in the fruit and part of it is on the ground. Could you eat it then? Or laver oil lamau? Or what if it fell out of the fruit, and as it's falling to the ground, you caught it in your mouth and you ate it? Yeah, are those things permissible? Teku, unclear. Boy, Ravashi has a kasha. Now, legag tamaramau, what if it was, you have let's say you have a bug in a detached fruit, and it didn't even get to the ground yet, but it left the fruit, and it's now on the roof of the fruit. So it's not in the apple, it's like on top of the apple. Or what if it's on top of the pit, but it's still inside the fruit, but it left its original location? Or or what if it went from one fruit to the next without actually getting open airspace? So there were two fruits next to each other, it bored a hole from one to the other. Is that a problem? So it's moving within the fruit, but it never left the fruit itself. Teku, unclear. Amr of Shishi Beridavidi. Kukiani asura. The kukiani is a worm that is found in the liver and lungs of animals. That's a problem. Again, if the bugs were to be created in the animal itself, if they were never left the animal itself, that would be permissible. But he says it's a problem. My time a why? But they never left the animal. The answer is me'alma asi. Rav Sheshis believes that these worms were not generated inside the animal itself, but rather these are outside bugs that the animal ate. And they went through the belly of the animal. They eventually got to the liver and the lungs somehow. But it's not. If the bugs were created in the animal itself, that the animal had a bacteria inside that it was created bugs, that would be fine because they never sheretz al haaretz. Must be these bugs came from outside and the animal consumed them. So says the Gemara. Masker Rashi said, wait a minute. If the bugs came from outside, wouldn't the bugs be in the stomach? Right? If you ate it, it went in the stomach. How did it get to the liver and the lungs? They would be in the stomach. Ikad Amri, some say, Amr Rav Shisha Beri Darvidi, Kukiani Shari, some have a different version, that he actually said these bugs are permissible. My taima mine gavli. In the liver and lungs, they're permissible because they were created in the animal itself. Rav Ashi Pshita, Rav Ashi said to him, it's pashit. Of course they came from the bug itself. How else could they have gotten there? You think the animal ate it? If the animal ate the bugs and they're coming out, they would have come in from the stomach. They wouldn't have come through the liver and lungs. What's the halacha? Kukiani Yasura. The halacha is that they're aser. Why? Because they came from outside. But wait, if they came from outside, how'd they get into the liver and the lungs? The answer is they went through the animal's nostrils. The Gemara says, "My time minei nayim va'ayalevis b'usay." They went through the animal's nostrils when the animal's sleeping. Okay, Teilah, regarding worms, Darni debisra asira. Larvae that are found in meat are forbidden. We'll see why in a moment. But the kavre sharian. But if they're found in fish, they're permissible. Now the Gemara is going to explain. This is Pashtas talking about a case where they were created in the animal itself, but now there's a distinction between animals and fish. What should it be? We have worms and fish are fine. Worms and and animals are a problem. But this is how we paskin. We paskin that worms and fish, if they came from within the fish itself, are permissible as opposed to worms that came from outside that creeped into the fish. This is apparently there were worms in herring. Rav Belsky by his Levaya, Rav Gnak said that apparently there was a big problem. And Rav Belsky got up and he was mater the worms and the type of fish, and it was a big massive heter. And he said there was machazik oilam, whatever the cheshbon is. So the Gemara says, Amr Ravina Le'imi. Ravina once said to his mother. Apparently Ravina's mother found bugs in the fish. He says, "Ivli mi v'ani echol." He says, "Just mush them in, and I'll eat them." Meaning, I don't want to see them. As long as I'm not grossed out, I'll eat them. In other words, he felt that you could eat the bugs in the fish. The Gemara just has to speak out. What is the difference between fish and meat? If there's a bug in the meat, that's a problem. But bugs in the fish are okay. The bugs seemingly did not come from the outside sources. So what's the difference? What is the difference between fish and animals? I'll say it outside, I'll say it inside. The difference is that by animals, because it requires shechita, every part of the animal, for it to be mutter, it has to be that the shechita affects that part of the animal. If the worms are inside of the animal, that means that the shechita would have to be mater it. Shechita cannot be mater in bugs. Meaning, the animal requires shechita, which means in order to eat a part of the animal, every part of the animal has to have gone through a shechita. Shechita is not something that is shaykh by worms. It's not something that it's not recognized. Therefore, it's going to be a problem. But by a fish, it doesn't require shechita. It means a chiddush that the shechita of the animal does not help for the worms. Because it's not shaykh shechita by worms. And therefore, it's just a part of the animal that's sort of outside of shechita. It's a chiddush. But when it comes to bugs in the fish doesn't require shechita. It just has to be taken out of the water. So, he took it out of the water. He did that for the worms as well. Okay. The Gemara says, "Amr lehachi hasha behema b'shchita hu demishtaria v'hani midloika mahani leishchita b'isura kaima avodog masiv ba'am mishtari v'hani kikagam be'terika gavon." That's a distinction. Okay, just to finish up, Tanar Abanon, Hoylech al Gacha, and the bugs, the pasuk describes different creepy crawlies. It says the ones that go on their belly, Zenachash, that's referring to a snake. That's a source you're not allowed to eat snakes. Kol, Larabos, Hashilshol, Vesadamil Shilshol. It includes worms and all things that resemble worms. Al Arba, that has 4 legs. Ze'akrev, that refers to a scorpion. Kol Hoylech, that has many legs. Larabos is Achipoishes, Vesadamil Chipoishes. Kol Hoylech means it walks. That refers to beetles and all other bugs that move. Marber aglain, the pasuk says a bug that has a lot of legs. Zenadal, it's a centipede. And Kol Rabbis is a daimim, that includes all bugs that look like centipedes, that act like centipedes, and this includes all of the insects. Tanya, just to finish up the parak, Rav Yosi ben Dur Maskos Oimer, Leviasan Dag Tarhu. Leviasan, the Suda by Mashiach, Leviasan is a kosher fish. How do I know that Leviasan is a kosher fish? Now, in order to be a kosher fish, it has to have fins and scales. Shenamar, Gava Afike Meganim, the pasuk says its pride is in the strength of its shields. Shields is the scales. Tachtav Chadudi Cheresh, under him are pointed shards. That's the fins. Afike Meganim Kaskasim, Tachtav Chadudi Cheresh in Snafir. So it has Snafir and Kaskasim, so you see that it's a kosher fish. Hadrin Allah Elu Trefus. All right, we'll pick it up tomorrow.